He was covered in scars. His body, once powerful and proud, now trembled under the weight of what he had endured. Years of pain, years of being paraded into arenas, blinded by stadium lights and deafened by roars, not of admiration, but bloodlust. They called him El Diablo, the demon, because he fought with fire, but that fire had been beaten out of him, horns chipped, skin torn, knees shaking. On what was supposed to be his final night, chained in a pen behind the arena in Seville, no one looked at him. He wasn't worth the attention anymore. A failed beast, a soon-to-be corpse, until a man walked in, quiet, no camera crew, no crowd, just a look in his eyes that didn't see a monster, but something broken that still deserved to live. That night, the arena gate didn't open. The pen did, and the bull, limping, bleeding, was led into a truck headed not to slaughter, but to a sanctuary. And for the first time in years, the crowd didn't matter. The lights didn't matter, because the man beside him had given him something he had forgotten existed. A second chance. They named him Mateo at the sanctuary. A name, not a number. He arrived barely able to stand. His ribs showed through his hide. His eyes were sunken, filled with a distrust that no amount of kindness could erase overnight. But Luis, the man who rescued him, didn't rush him. He didn't pet him or force affection. He just sat. Every day, outside the wooden fence, rain or sun, morning or night, just sat and watched. Brought fresh hay, warm blankets, clean water, not expecting anything in return. At first, Mateo ignored him. Then he watched him. Then he started to wait for him. The healing was slow. His legs regained strength. The cuts began to fade. But something more important happened. Mateo stopped flinching when humans approached. He stopped hiding in the far corner of the field. He started to walk toward the man with the weathered boots and quiet eyes. One morning, Luis arrived to find Mateo standing at the gate, waiting, not with fear, but with patience. And when Luis opened the gate and stepped into the field, something no one expected happened. Mateo, once feared, once brutal, lowered his head and bowed, not from pain, not from exhaustion, but with intention, with reverence, as if saying, "I remember." From that day on, something changed, not just in Mateo, but in everyone who saw him. Other bulls kept their distance, but Mateo walked freely alongside Luis, not as a pet, not as a possession, but as a quiet companion. His eyes no longer held fire or fear, but something deeper: recognition, trust, and maybe forgiveness. Luis never tried to train him. There were no tricks, no rewards, just presence, just time. Mateo would often stand beside him as he worked the land, mowing, fixing fences, tending to the garden. Sometimes he'd nudge Luis with his head when the man sat too long under the sun, almost as if reminding him to drink water or take a break. Volunteers whispered about it, some in disbelief. Others would just stand in silence, watching the once feared animal now behaving like a guardian. People who came to adopt animals or donate to the sanctuary always asked the same thing. "Is that the bull from the arena videos?" Louis would nod, but he never told the full story, because it wasn't something to be told. It was something to be witnessed. There was one moment, a moment that no one recorded, no one photographed, but it would live in Luis' memory forever. A child had wandered too close to a nearby enclosure. A nervous horse had bucked against the gate, and the latch had snapped open. Before Luis could even react, the young foal began panicking and kicking up dirt, heading toward the child frozen in place. But Mateo moved first. He stepped between the child and the chaos, his massive body blocking the path of the frightened horse. No aggression, no noise, just a calm, immovable wall of flesh and instinct. The horse veered away. The child was safe. And as Luis ran over, breathless, heart pounding, he found the bull already lowering his head to the child, gentle, slow, as if asking, "Are you all right?" The mother wept. The child hugged his leg. And Luis, he understood. Mateo hadn't just been rescued. He had found his reason to exist. And maybe, just maybe, he had decided long ago, when he bowed that first time, that his fight was over. But his purpose was just beginning. Word of the gentle bull spread beyond the sanctuary. Local newspapers ran stories. A short documentary crew visited, filming Mateo as he stood calmly beside Luis, allowing children to stroke his back, his eyes soft and unblinking. They captured the silence between them, the kind of silence that speaks louder than any narration. Schools began scheduling visits, not to see an exhibit, but to meet a soul. Luis was cautious. He didn't want Mateo to become a spectacle again, but he quickly realized Mateo wasn't the attraction. He was the lesson. He taught children who had known only fear of animals to reach out with care. He showed volunteers what patience truly meant. He reminded those who came looking for miracles that sometimes healing didn't roar. It simply stood beside you every day without asking for praise. There was a boy who barely spoke, autistic, withdrawn. His mother brought him to the sanctuary hoping that maybe the open space would help. He didn't respond to anyone, not even to Luis. But Mateo? Mateo walked up to him slowly, lowered his head, and stood perfectly still. The boy looked at him for a long time, then placed his hand on Mateo's side. It became a routine. Every Sunday, they'd sit together for hours. No talking, no movement, just being. After a few months, the boy spoke his first word outside of home. Mateo. Luis watched moments like this unfold again and again. Moments that no one could plan or predict. A grieving widow who found comfort laying her hand on Mateo's back. A soldier with PTSD who sat in the pasture and finally, after years, cried freely. It became clear Mateo wasn't just healing, he was helping others heal. He didn't need a pasture fence or a title. He had become something more than anyone expected. A symbol, not of strength through force, but of dignity through survival. The very animal once cheered against in roaring arenas was now the silent center of 100 changed lives. And still, every morning, before the sun fully rose, Mateo would wait by the gate for Luis, not because he had to, but because he chose to. Even as his joints began to ache with age and his steps grew slower, Mateo never failed to meet Luis at the gate each morning. Some days Luis would arrive with fresh apples, other days just a soft pat on the shoulder. There were no expectations, no routine, just two souls that found peace in each other's presence. Luis often spoke to him, not with commands but with stories. He'd tell Mateo about the letters he got from visitors, the teenager who gave up backyard bull riding after meeting him, the retired matador who had watched Mateo's video and decided to donate his estate to animal sanctuaries. Lives were changing, quietly, radically. But Mateo never understood any of that. What he did understand was this. The man who had once opened a gate had never once tried to shut him in. And so, when Luis sat in the grass with tired bones and let out a sigh heavier than usual, Mateo simply lay beside him, pressing his massive frame gently into his side. No gesture, no drama, just presence, the kind that doesn't need to be explained. As years went by, volunteers began taking over more duties at the sanctuary. Luis had grown older too. His steps weren't as quick. His hands trembled a bit when he poured feed. But every evening, without fail, he'd take a wooden chair and sit just outside the pasture. Mateo would wander over, lean his head softly into Luis's chest, and close his eyes. Neighbors sometimes stopped on the road just to watch them. Not out of curiosity, but respect. Everyone in the village knew the story of the bull who had bowed, but what they couldn't know, what no camera, no article could ever capture, was the quiet ritual that unfolded in that field every day. A man who had once opened a gate, a bull who had once lowered his head, and a bond that never once asked to be understood, only witnessed. Over time, that bond became part of the land itself. People began visiting not just to meet the animals, but to sit in silence near Mateo and Luis, hoping to feel a fragment of what had grown between them. Teachers brought students who struggled with discipline. Therapists brought patients who had stopped speaking. Journalists tried to find the perfect words to describe it. None truly could. Mateo didn't do tricks. He didn't come when called or perform for cameras. He simply was. And that somehow was enough to shift something in people. In a world too fast, too loud, too cruel, he was steady, gentle, constant. Even on stormy days when rain fell sideways and the wind howled through the trees, Luis would sit under the tin awning by the barn, and Mateo would stand just close enough that his shoulder brushed the edge, as if saying, "I'm here, even in this." And when Luis had to be taken to the hospital one winter, Mateo refused to eat. He stood by the pasture gate for hours, unmoving. The volunteers tried everything: fresh hay, apples, even Luis's old jacket. But he barely blinked. He waited. 3 days later, when Luis returned, tired, thinner, leaning on a cane, Mateo didn't run. He didn't bellow or charge. He simply walked forward, slowly, pressed his forehead against Luis's chest, and exhaled. That breath said more than any reunion ever could. It said, "I knew you'd come back." After that day, Luis started keeping a journal. Not for himself, but for whoever would care for Mateo after him. He filled pages with observations, favorite spots, quirks, memories. But one line kept appearing, again and again, in different words. "This isn't just a bull. This is a friend, and he remembers." As Mateo aged, his strength faded. He spent more time lying in the sun, blinking slowly at the world. But he never missed a morning by the gate. Even when standing hurt, even when his legs trembled, even when Luis said softly, "You can rest today, old boy," Mateo still chose to rise. Because some bonds don't fade, they deepen. Like roots no storm can shake. Even when his body began to betray him, when rising took longer and sleep came sooner, Mateo kept his quiet routine. He no longer ran. He no longer played. But each morning, just as the sun peeled back the darkness, he stood at the same corner of the pasture, waiting, watching the gate, not with urgency but with patience, like someone who knew that love doesn't need to be loud to be real. Luis, too, had grown slower. His hair had turned white at the edges. His hands bore the stiffness of old work. But every day, without fail, he met Mateo's gaze across the field. And when he reached the gate, the bull would still lower his head, not out of submission, but reverence, out of memory. People continued to visit the sanctuary, but over time they came with a different intention. Not to take selfies or post videos, but to understand, to feel, to simply sit on the wooden benches and watch this wordless exchange between two old souls who had no need for explanation. One day, a woman who had lost her father sat on a bench near the pasture. She had heard of Mateo, watched the documentaries, read the stories, but she didn't speak when she arrived. She just sat for hours. Mateo noticed her. Slowly, deliberately, he walked toward the fence and stood beside her. No noise, no movement, just presence. She reached out and placed her hand on his side, and she cried. Not because she was sad, but because for the first time in years, she didn't feel alone. Stories like this became common. People came with wounds they couldn't explain. Mateo didn't heal them with tricks or affection. He simply stood near them and let them be seen, fully, without judgment. The bond between Luis and Mateo had started with rescue, but it had grown into something far greater. It had become a mirror, a quiet lesson, a soft reminder that even the most broken souls, when met with patience and presence, can remember who they are meant to be. Mateo didn't need his past rewritten. He carried it with grace, every scar, every memory. But he also carried something else, peace. And in his silence, others found their own. It became a quiet pilgrimage. People didn't advertise their visits. There were no flashy signs, no ticket booths, just a gravel road, a weathered wooden sign that read El Refugio, and a pasture where an old bull waited at sunrise. Visitors came from cities, from farms, from countries thousands of miles away. Some brought stories, others brought only silence, but they all left something behind: grief, guilt, fear, anger. And somehow Mateo carried it without ever being burdened. Luis had long since stopped questioning it. He used to wonder how one animal could hold so much space for others. But now he understood. Mateo was never just a bull. He was living proof that survival wasn't the end of the story, that healing didn't erase scars, but allowed you to walk with them and still find peace. Children grew up coming to see him. One girl who had visited every year since she was 5 asked Luis when she turned 12, "Why does he always look at me like that?" Luis smiled and answered, "Because he sees you, even when you don't see yourself." Mateo's presence had become more than symbolic. It was foundational. The sanctuary built new fences, planted new trees, expanded its grounds, but one thing never changed. The space where Mateo stood remained untouched. It was his, a sacred place, not because it was beautiful, but because it had witnessed suffering, redemption, and everything in between. Luis began writing letters to leave behind, not just for whoever would care for the sanctuary after him, but for the people who would someday ask why a statue of a bull stood at the edge of the field. He wrote, "If you're reading this, you've likely heard the story, but I hope you feel it more than you know it. This place exists because one animal chose trust over fear, and one man chose compassion over silence. We met in the middle, and the world got quieter because of it." Years passed, but that quiet never left. It settled into the soil, into the trees that had grown taller around the pasture, into the wood grain of the old bench near the fence where Luis would sit each morning with a thermos of coffee in hand, waiting. Just like Mateo. Mateo aged with grace. His coat dulled with time, and his once powerful frame moved more deliberately. But the fire in his eyes never faded. Neither did the weight of his presence. When he stood, people hushed. When he walked, heads turned. And when he simply rested beneath the shade of the old oak tree in the pasture's center, it felt like the world paused to take a breath with him. Luis often said, "He doesn't make noise, but somehow he still speaks the loudest." And it was true. In a world obsessed with volume, Mateo's silence cut through. It asked nothing, promised nothing, it simply was. One afternoon, during a quiet visit from a local school, a boy broke away from the group and wandered toward Mateo. The teachers called after him, nervous, but Luis raised a hand. "Let him go," he said softly. The boy approached slowly, hands at his sides. Mateo didn't move, just watched. Then the boy sat down, cross-legged, not 2 feet away from the bull's massive face. He whispered something. No one could hear what, but Luis saw Mateo blink slowly, lower his head and exhale, just once. The boy stayed there for an hour, no talking, no phone, just being. When he finally stood and rejoined his group, he didn't speak about it. But later his mother wrote to Luis, saying her son hadn't slept peacefully in months. That night he did. It became clear over the years. Mateo didn't just offer a space to witness, he made space, inside people, for something they didn't even know they needed. Stillness, safety, a place to remember how to feel. And always beside him was Luis. Their companionship no longer needed explanation. It simply existed, an unspoken rhythm between two lives that had once been broken by men who wanted noise, and who had, against all odds, found peace in silence. Every morning followed the same quiet choreography. The sun slipped over the horizon, Luis opened the wooden gate, and Mateo stood, waiting, not because he was called, but because he knew. They would walk the fence line together slowly, as they always had. Luis would speak softly about the weather, about the names of the new calves, about things that didn't matter and yet somehow did. Mateo never answered. He didn't need to. His steps matched Luis's. His gaze held steady. His presence said more than words ever could. There were no goodbyes between them, only rituals. At dusk, Luis would return to the gate with a handful of hay, even though someone else had already fed Mateo. He'd lay it down anyway, just to be part of the day's final gesture. Mateo would wander over, not hungry, just present, and nudge his head against Luis's arm before settling under the oak tree. People began calling the field Mateo's Circle, not for its shape, but for what it had come to represent. A space where pain ended and peace began. A place where time seemed to stretch and slow, not because of any magic, but because of two souls who had chosen to remain, not out of obligation, but out of something quieter, stronger, devotedness. One evening, a storm rolled through earlier than expected. Volunteers rushed to secure barns and equipment. Luis stayed out longer than he should have. As thunder cracked the air, he slipped in the mud just outside the pasture. Mateo, already beneath the oak, lifted his head, and then he rose, despite the pain in his knees, despite the wind and the pouring rain. He walked straight to Luis and stood over him, shielding him with his body. When the storm passed, Luis didn't speak about it. He just dried his clothes, made tea, and later told the staff, "He always knows when to stand between me and the world." And he did, until the very end. Years later, after Luis passed quietly in his sleep, the sanctuary didn't announce it with fanfare. There was no ceremony, no press release, just a small note taped to the main gate. "Luis is resting now. Mateo knows." And he did. The morning after, Mateo didn't go to the gate. He didn't walk the fence line. He stood beneath the oak tree, the same place he had spent countless evenings beside the man who once opened his cage, not with a rope, but with mercy. He didn't eat that day, didn't lie down. He just stood, still, unmoving, facing the path Luis used to take each morning. By dusk, he slowly lowered himself to the grass, and he never rose again. They buried him at the foot of the tree. No statue was built, no plaque, just two simple wooden markers. One that read Luis, the other Mateo, and between them a space that no one dared walk through. Today, new animals live at the sanctuary, new volunteers, new stories. But every morning someone leaves an apple near the oak, not because they expect it to be eaten, but because some debts are paid in silence. And if you ask the oldest volunteer why the ground there feels different, why even the wind seems softer when you pass through that field, she'll smile and say, "It's because two souls made peace there." And because sometimes the loudest love is the one that never needed a single word. If this story touched you, share it. Not just for Mateo, not just for Luis, but for every soul who ever chose kindness when it was easier to look away. Because somewhere out there, someone is still waiting for their gate to open.